The blood on Eleanor Zane's skirts had long since dried to a rust-brown stain, but the whispers followed her like vultures circling carrion as she limped through the dusty streets of Las Vegas, Nevada in the summer of 1878. 3 months had passed since the stagecoach accident that shattered her left leg in 2 places, and though the bone had knitted back together under Doc Holloway's careful ministrations, it had healed shorter than the right, leaving her with a pronounced hitch in her step that marked her as damaged goods in a frontier town where survival demanded physical perfection. Eleanor had learned to ignore the sidelong glances and the barely concealed snickers from the women outside the general store, their parasols casting lace shadows across their pinched faces as they watched her struggle up the wooden steps to the mercantile. She had grown accustomed to the way conversations died when she entered a room, only to resume in hushed tones the moment she turned her back. What cut deepest were not the stranger's judgments but the betrayal of people she had once called friends, like Margaret Sullivan, who had promised eternal friendship just last spring before the accident, who now crossed to the opposite side of the street rather than walk beside someone who could not keep pace with polite society's demands. The relentless Nevada sun beat down on the ramshackle collection of buildings that comprised Las Vegas, a town that existed primarily as a way station for travelers heading to the California goldfields or the silver mines of the Comstock Lode. Eleanor's father had brought her here 5 years ago when she was 18, seeking his fortune in a land speculation scheme that had evaporated like morning dew on hot sand. He had died of consumption the following winter, leaving Eleanor alone except for her employer, Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, who ran a boarding house for respectable single men and had taken pity on the orphaned girl. That pity had limits, Eleanor discovered, when she returned from her cousin's wedding in Carson City with a shattered leg and diminished prospects. Mrs. Whitmore had made it abundantly clear that a crippled girl could not manage the physical demands of changing linens, hauling water, and climbing stairs to deliver meals to boarders. She had given Eleanor until the end of August to find alternative employment, a deadline that loomed just 2 weeks away with all the menace of a hangman's noose. Eleanor pushed through the door of Hammond's General Store, the bell announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock her circumstances. She needed to purchase thread and needles, hoping to take in mending work that could be done while sitting, an occupation that would not tax her damaged leg. The store smelled of leather and tobacco, coffee beans, and the peculiar mineral scent of new fabric. 2 women stood at the counter, wives of prosperous merchants, their conversation halting mid-sentence as Eleanor entered. "Poor thing," one of them whispered, not quite softly enough. "Such a shame about her leg. I heard she can barely walk 100 yards without needing to rest." "My husband says no man will have her now," the other replied. "Who wants a wife who cannot even manage her own household?" Eleanor kept her chin high and her eyes forward, pretending deafness as she made her way to the notions section. Her leg ached from the morning's exertions, a deep throbbing that radiated from hip to ankle, but she refused to show weakness in front of these women who already considered her less than whole. She selected her items quickly, paid Mr. Hammond with coins carefully counted from her dwindling savings, and escaped back into the blazing heat of the afternoon. The walk back to the boarding house took longer than it should have, her leg protesting each step, until she was forced to stop and lean against the rough adobe wall of the assayer's office, breathing hard and blinking back tears of frustration and pain. A group of cowboys passed on horseback, their laughter floating back to her as one of them pointed in her direction. She could not hear their words, but their meaning was clear enough in the exaggerated limp one of them performed in his saddle, drawing guffaws from his companions. Eleanor waited until they disappeared around the corner before continuing her painful journey home. By the time she reached the boarding house, her vision had narrowed to a tunnel and sweat soaked her dress despite the dry heat. She collapsed into the rocking chair on the front porch, knowing Mrs. Whitmore would scold her for idleness, but unable to summon the strength to care. "Miss Zane, there is a gentleman caller for you," Mrs. Whitmore announced from the doorway, her tone suggesting that this development was both unexpected and slightly scandalous. "He is waiting in the parlor." Eleanor could not imagine who would call on her. She had no male acquaintances beyond the boarders who rented rooms upstairs, and they barely acknowledged her existence these days. She hauled herself upright, using the porch railing for support, and followed Mrs. Whitmore inside to the stuffy front parlor where visitors were received. The man who rose from the horsehair settee seemed too large for the delicate furniture and genteel surroundings. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained the seams of his buckskin shirt. His hair, a deep brown shot through with copper highlights from the sun, fell past his collar in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a hunting knife when it grew too long to be practical. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were what held Eleanor's attention, a startling gray-blue like mountain lakes, framed by the kind of deep lines that came from squinting at distant horizons. "Miss Eleanor Zane." His voice was deep and rough, as if he did not use it often. "My name is Xavier Crane. Your cousin Martha sent me." Eleanor's mind raced to place the connection. Martha lived in Carson City with her husband and their growing brood of children. She had visited Eleanor twice during her long recovery, bringing soups and sympathy but no solutions to the problem of Eleanor's uncertain future. "Please, sit down," Eleanor said, lowering herself carefully into the chair opposite him. "I am afraid you have me at a disadvantage, Mr. Crane. My cousin did not mention you in her last letter." Xavier Crane remained standing until she was seated, displaying manners that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he spoke. "I have a cabin in the mountains about 30 miles northwest of here, up near the Spring Mountains. I trap and hunt, bring furs and meat down to trade every few months. Last time I was in Carson City, I did some work for your cousin's husband, fixing his barn roof. Martha mentioned you were looking for employment." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. The idea that her cousin was discussing her desperate circumstances with strangers stung her pride, even as she recognized that Martha had only been trying to help. "I see. And what employment did you have in mind, Mr. Crane?" He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the delicacy of the situation. "My wife died 2 years ago. Influenza took her in the winter of '76. We had been married for 5 years and she kept the cabin, did the cooking and preserving, made our clothes. I have been managing on my own since then, but I am not skilled at those tasks. I burn more food than I eat, and my clothes are held together more by hope than by thread." Eleanor waited, not sure where this explanation was leading. "I am looking for someone to keep house," Xavier continued. "Someone to cook and clean and mend. The work is not easy and the location is isolated, but I would provide room and board and pay fair wages. $30 a month, plus all your needs met." It was a generous offer, far more than Eleanor could hope to earn taking in mending, but the impropriety of the arrangement made her hesitate. "Mr. Crane, surely you understand that for an unmarried woman to live alone with an unmarried man would be highly inappropriate." "I have considered that," Xavier said. "The cabin has 2 rooms. You would have complete privacy, and I give you my word as a gentleman that you would be treated with nothing but respect. "I am not looking for a wife, Miss Zane. I am looking for an employee." The bluntness of his words should have offended her, but Eleanor found them oddly reassuring. At least he was being honest about his expectations, unlike so many men who pretended kindness while harboring other intentions. "Your cousin also mentioned your injury," Xavier said, and Eleanor stiffened, waiting for the rejection she had grown to expect. "She said you have difficulty with long distances and heavy labor. I want to be clear about what the position would require. The cooking and mending can be done sitting down, and I would not expect you to haul water or chop wood. Those are tasks I can manage myself. But there is preservation work to be done when I bring in game, and the cabin requires regular cleaning. If you feel the work is beyond your capabilities, I will understand." Eleanor studied his face, looking for signs of pity or condescension, but found only a straightforward assessment of practical matters. He was offering her honest work at honest wages, without pretense or false sympathy. It was more than anyone else in this town had offered her in 3 months. "How soon would you need an answer?" she asked. "I plan to head back up to the cabin tomorrow morning," Xavier said. "If you decided to accept, you could come with me then. If you need more time to consider, I could return in a week, though I would prefer to settle the matter sooner. Tomorrow." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and risk. Eleanor thought of Mrs. Whitmore's deadline, of the endless parade of small humiliations that made up her days in Las Vegas, of the future that stretched before her like a desert barren and unforgiving. What did she really have to lose by accepting this strange offer from this strange mountain man? "I would need to pack my belongings," Eleanor said slowly, "and say goodbye to Mrs. Whitmore." Xavier Crane's weathered face split into a smile that transformed his stern features. "Does that mean you are accepting?" "It means I am accepting," Eleanor confirmed, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Though I reserve the right to change my mind if the situation proves untenable." "Fair enough," Xavier agreed. "I will come by at first light with a wagon. Bring whatever possessions you want to keep. There is room for everything you need." After Xavier left, Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the parlor doorway with unseemly haste, suggesting she had been listening at the keyhole. "Are you truly considering this madness, Eleanor? Going off into the wilderness with a man you have never met? Think of your reputation." "My reputation was destroyed the moment I returned from Carson City with a limp," Eleanor said quietly. "At least Mr. Crane is offering me honest work and fair wages. That is more than I can find in this town." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth compressed into a thin line of disapproval, but she could hardly argue with the truth of Eleanor's statement. "Very well. I suppose you know your own mind. I will expect you to settle your account before you leave." Eleanor spent the rest of the day, and most of the night, packing her few possessions into the battered trunk that had belonged to her mother. She owned little beyond clothing and a few precious books, a cameo brooch that had been her grandmother's, and a quilt her mother had sewn during the last winter of her life. Everything fit easily into the trunk with room to spare, a testament to how little she had accumulated in 23 years of living. She did not sleep, kept awake by a mixture of nervous anticipation and lingering pain in her leg. She kept turning over Xavier Crane's words in her mind, trying to find hidden meanings or warning signs she might have missed. But he had been nothing but straightforward, even blunt in his proposition. He needed a housekeeper. She needed employment. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. The sky was just beginning to lighten from black to deep blue when she heard the sound of wagon wheels on the street outside. Eleanor rose stiffly from bed, her leg always worse in the mornings before she had a chance to work out the stiffness. She dressed quickly in her most practical traveling outfit, a dark blue dress with minimal petticoats that would not tangle or restrict movement. By the time she had finished pinning up her hair, Xavier was knocking at the front door. He loaded her trunk into the wagon bed without apparent effort, lifting the heavy piece as if it weighed nothing. The wagon itself was sturdy and well-maintained, pulled by a pair of strong mules that stood patiently in the traces. Xavier had arranged blankets over the seat to provide some cushioning against the rough road ahead. Mrs. Whitmore appeared at the door in her dressing gown, her face pinched with disapproval, and something that might have been concern. "You will write and let me know you arrived safely," she commanded, and Eleanor felt a rush of unexpected affection for this difficult woman who had at least provided her with shelter when she had nowhere else to turn. "I will," Eleanor promised. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Whitmore." The older woman sniffed and retreated inside without another word, but Eleanor saw her watching from the window as Xavier helped Eleanor up onto the wagon seat. His hands on her waist were gentle but impersonal, offering support without presumption. Eleanor settled herself as comfortably as possible, knowing the journey ahead would test her endurance. They left Las Vegas as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. The town looked almost beautiful in the early light, though Eleanor knew the harsh reality that daylight would reveal. She did not look back as they rolled northward, leaving behind the only life she had known for the past 5 years. Xavier drove in silence, his attention focused on the rough trail that led away from the settled areas and into the wild country beyond. Eleanor appreciated his lack of forced conversation, content to watch the landscape change as they climbed gradually into the foothills. The sagebrush and creosote of the valley floor gave way to juniper and pinyon pine, the air growing slightly cooler and sweeter with each mile. After 2 hours of steady travel, Xavier pulled the wagon to a stop near a small spring that bubbled from the rocks. "We will rest here," he announced. "Let the mules drink and give them a chance to graze." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon seat, trying not to wince as her stiff leg protested the movement. She had been sitting in one position for too long, and the constant jostling of the wagon had aggravated the old injury. She took a few experimental steps, fighting to keep her gait as even as possible, but the pain was sharp and immediate. Xavier unhitched the mules and led them to water, then returned with a canteen and a packet of dried meat and biscuits. "You should eat something," he said, offering her the food. "The next stretch is rougher and we will not stop again until we reach the cabin." "How much farther is it?" Eleanor asked, accepting the canteen gratefully. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of minerals. "Another 4 hours, maybe 5, Xavier said. "The trail gets steeper from here, and there are places where the wagon has to go slow. We should arrive before dark if we do not encounter any trouble. 4 more hours." Eleanor felt her heart sink at the prospect, knowing her leg would not tolerate that much longer without serious consequences. But she had committed to this course of action, and she would not shame herself by complaining. She ate the simple meal Xavier had provided, then walked slowly around the spring to try to work some of the stiffness from her muscles. When they resumed their journey, the trail indeed became rougher and steeper, winding through canyons and over ridges that offered spectacular views of the valley below. Eleanor gripped the edge of the seat to keep from being thrown around as the wagon navigated rocks and ruts, each jolt sending fresh pain shooting through her leg. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, determined not to cry out. Xavier glanced at her from time to time, but said nothing, his expression unreadable behind his beard. Eleanor wondered what he was thinking, whether he was already regretting his decision to hire a crippled housekeeper who could not even manage a wagon ride without obvious distress. The sun had passed its zenith and begun its descent toward the western mountains when Eleanor finally had to admit defeat. "Mr. Crane," she said quietly, hating the words even as she spoke them, "I need to stop, just for a moment." Xavier pulled the mules to an immediate halt. "We can rest as long as you need," he said simply. "There is no rush." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, nearly crying out as her leg buckled beneath her. She would have fallen if Xavier had not moved with surprising speed to catch her, his strong arm steadying her until she regained her balance. "How bad is it?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only concern. "I will be fine," Eleanor insisted, pulling away from his support with as much dignity as she could muster. "I just need to walk for a bit." She managed perhaps a dozen steps before the pain became too much, forcing her to lean against a large boulder at the side of the trail. Tears of frustration blurred her vision, and she dashed them away angrily with the back of her hand. She had known this journey would be difficult, but she had not anticipated how thoroughly her damaged leg would betray her. Xavier came to stand beside her, his shadow providing welcome relief from the sun. "Miss Zane, I am going to make a suggestion, and I want you to hear me out before you refuse." Eleanor looked up at him warily. "The wagon is causing too much jarring," Xavier said. "You would do better on horseback where you could control your own movement, but I do not think your leg will tolerate sitting a saddle for the remaining distance." "Then what do you suggest?" Eleanor asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I could carry you," Xavier said bluntly. "I have carried heavier loads farther distances. You would ride on my back, and I would walk beside the wagon. It is slower, but it would save you additional pain." The suggestion was so outrageous that Eleanor almost laughed. "Mr. Crane, I cannot possibly allow you to carry me like a sack of grain." "Why not?" he asked reasonably. "You are injured and in pain. I have the strength to help. There is no shame in accepting assistance when it is needed." "What about your strength?" Eleanor protested. "You cannot possibly carry a grown woman for 4 hours through mountain terrain." "I have done harder things," Xavier said with such complete confidence that Eleanor found herself almost believing him. "The question is whether your pride will allow you to accept help, or whether you would rather suffer in silence to preserve some notion of propriety that matters to no one but yourself out here." His words stung because they were true. Eleanor had spent 3 months in Las Vegas trying to pretend she did not need help, that she could manage on her own despite her injury. Where had that pride gotten her except lonely and desperate and now in agony on the side of a mountain? "Very well," she said quietly. "If you are certain you do not mind." Xavier's response was to turn his back to her and crouch down slightly. "Climb on. Put your arms around my shoulders and your legs around my waist. I will hold you secure." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before following his instructions. She wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the solid muscle of his shoulders beneath her hands, and locked her legs around his waist as best she could, with one leg stiff and painful. Xavier straightened easily, adjusting his grip on her thighs to distribute her weight, and began walking beside the wagon. The relief was immediate. Without the constant pounding of the wagon, Eleanor's leg could rest, and the warmth of Xavier's broad back against her chest was oddly comforting. She felt acutely aware of the impropriety of their position, but there was no one to see them out here in the wilderness, and Xavier's touch remained completely impersonal, his hands on her legs firm but respectful. He walked steadily upward, guiding the mules with verbal commands when they needed direction, never once complaining about the additional burden he carried. Eleanor could feel the play of muscles in his back and shoulders as he moved, the easy strength that made her weight seem inconsequential. His breathing remained even and unhurried, and when the trail grew particularly steep, he simply adjusted his grip and continued without pause. "You are not exaggerating about your strength," Eleanor said after they had traveled perhaps a mile this way. "I spend my days hauling traps and pelts and game," Xavier replied. "A person tends to build muscle doing that kind of work." "Still, this cannot be easy," Eleanor said. "Please tell me if you need to rest." "I will," Xavier promised, "but I am fine for now. How is your leg?" "Better," Eleanor admitted. "Much better, actually. Thank you for suggesting this." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, Eleanor watching the landscape change as they climbed higher into the mountains. The air grew noticeably cooler, and pine trees became more abundant, their scent sharp and clean after the dusty heat of the desert below. Birds called from the branches, and once Eleanor spotted a deer watching them from a distance before bounding away into the forest. Xavier did eventually stop to rest, but only twice in the remaining journey, and each time he seemed more concerned with giving the mules a break than with his own fatigue. He offered Eleanor water and asked about her comfort, but made no move to put her down, simply standing with her on his back until he deemed the mules sufficiently rested to continue. The sun was touching the western peaks when the trail rounded a final bend and opened into a small meadow. A cabin sat at the edge of the clearing, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, which confused Eleanor until she remembered Xavier had been living here alone for 2 years. He must have banked a fire before leaving to collect her. Xavier finally set her down gently, making sure she had her balance before stepping away. "Welcome to your new home," he said simply. Eleanor took a few tentative steps, testing her leg. It ached from the hours of travel, but the pain was manageable, nothing like the agony she had experienced in the wagon. She could hardly believe Xavier had carried her for the better part of 4 hours without complaint, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The cabin was larger than she had expected, with a covered porch running along the front and shuttered windows that suggested multiple rooms inside. A lean-to stable stood to one side, and Eleanor could see a garden plot, though it looked sadly neglected. A small stream ran along the far edge of the meadow, its water sparkling in the last light of day. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said honestly, and Xavier looked pleased. "It is isolated," he warned. "The nearest neighbor is 10 miles away, and we might not see another soul for weeks at a time. If you find the solitude oppressive, you should tell me now." Eleanor thought of the crowded streets of Las Vegas, the constant whispers and cruel stares, the way her injury had made her an object of public speculation and private mockery. "I think I can manage," she said dryly. Xavier smiled at that, a quick flash of white teeth in his bearded face, and Eleanor felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. She pushed the feeling aside firmly. He had been very clear that he was not looking for a wife, only a housekeeper. She would do well to remember that and maintain appropriate boundaries. Xavier unhitched the mules and led them to the stable while Eleanor explored the cabin. The main room was spacious and dominated by a large fireplace that clearly served for both heat and cooking. A heavy wooden table stood near the center of the room, flanked by rough chairs that looked handmade. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and cookware, and Eleanor noted with some amusement that Xavier had not been exaggerating about his culinary skills or lack thereof. The pots looked like they had not been properly cleaned in months, and the supplies were in disarray. A door at the back of the room led to a smaller chamber that must be the private room Xavier had mentioned. Eleanor stepped inside and found a bed frame with a rope lattice that would need a fresh mattress, a small dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was simple but clean, and it was hers. Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. She returned to the main room to find Xavier bringing in her trunk. He set it down in the smaller room and then stood awkwardly in the doorway, as if uncertain what to say now that they had actually arrived. "I should warn you, the place is not in the best condition," he began. "I can see that," Eleanor interrupted gently. "But nothing that cannot be fixed with some work. Why do you not show me where you keep your supplies, and I will see about making us some supper?" Relief crossed Xavier's face. "That would be welcome. I have been living mostly on jerky and hardtack for longer than I care to admit." He showed her the larder, which was better stocked than she had expected, with dried beans and salt pork, cornmeal and flour, even some preserved vegetables in jars that looked like they dated from his wife's time. Eleanor selected ingredients for a simple but hearty meal, sending Xavier to fetch water from the stream while she stoked the fire and cleaned the least offensive of the pots. Her leg protested as she moved around the cabin, but Eleanor ignored it, finding a strange satisfaction in the simple act of preparing food in her own kitchen, or at least a kitchen that would be hers for the foreseeable future. By the time Xavier returned with fresh water, she had beans soaking and cornbread batter mixed, and the cabin had begun to smell like a home instead of a bachelor's neglected shelter. They ate in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky, the simple meal tasting better than any Eleanor had eaten in months. Xavier ate with the focused intensity of a man who had been depriving himself of proper nutrition, finishing 3 helpings of beans and half the cornbread, before finally sitting back with a satisfied sigh. "That was excellent," he said. "I had forgotten what real food tastes like." "It was only beans and cornbread," Eleanor protested, but she felt pleased nonetheless. "It was edible and hot and did not taste like leather," Xavier countered. "That makes it excellent by my recent standards." He helped her clean up after the meal, his movements careful and deliberate as he learned the new rhythm of sharing his space with another person. Eleanor noticed he was scrupulous about not crowding her, always making sure to leave plenty of room when they both needed to reach for something, never allowing any unnecessary physical contact. As full darkness fell, Xavier lit lamps and showed Eleanor where he kept extra blankets for her mattress. "I will need to hunt tomorrow," he said. "We need fresh meat, and I want to check my trap lines. Will you be all right here alone?" "Of course," Eleanor said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. She had never been truly alone before, not like this, with miles of wilderness in every direction. Xavier seemed to sense her uncertainty. "I will not go far," he promised, "and I will be back before dark. If you need anything or if there is any trouble, fire 3 shots from the rifle. I will hear it and come back." "I do not know how to shoot a rifle," Eleanor admitted. "Then I will teach you tomorrow before I leave," Xavier said. "Every person living in the mountains should know how to defend themselves and how to signal for help." He showed her the rifle that hung above the door and the revolver he kept in a drawer near his bed, explaining the basic mechanics of each weapon. Eleanor tried to pay attention, but exhaustion was catching up with her after the long, painful day, and she found herself struggling to keep her eyes open. "Get some rest," Xavier said kindly. "We can continue your education tomorrow." Eleanor said good night and retreated to her small room, closing the door firmly behind her. She made up the bed with the blankets Xavier had provided, then changed into her nightgown and collapsed onto the mattress. Through the thin wall, she could hear Xavier moving around the main room, banking the fire and preparing for bed himself. She had made it. Against all odds and expectations, she had found a place where her injury did not define her, where she might be valued for what she could do rather than dismissed for what she could not. Xavier Crane had carried her when she tired and never complained once, treating her difficulty with matter-of-fact kindness rather than pity or scorn. Eleanor fell asleep with tears on her cheeks, though for the first time in months, they were not tears of despair. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Xavier moving quietly around the main room, trying not to disturb her. Eleanor dressed quickly, braiding her hair in a simple plait, and emerged to find him attempting to make breakfast with limited success. "Let me," she said, and he surrendered the cooking implements with obvious relief. Eleanor made flapjacks with the last of the buttermilk powder, serving them with wild honey that Xavier kept in a crock. They ate as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the meadow in shades of amber and gold. After breakfast, Xavier made good on his promise to teach her to shoot. They went outside where he set up a target against a dead tree and showed her how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it. Eleanor's first shot went wide by several feet, the recoil nearly knocking her over. Xavier steadied her with a hand on her shoulder, his touch brief and impersonal. "You are anticipating the kick," he said. "Relax your shoulders and let the rifle do the work." It took a dozen attempts before Eleanor managed to actually hit the target, and Xavier's grunt of approval felt like high praise. "That will do," he said. "Remember, 3 shots if you need me." He left shortly after, taking his own rifle and a pack for carrying game. Eleanor watched him disappear into the trees, feeling an unexpected pang of anxiety at being left alone. She shook off the feeling and turned her attention to the cabin, determined to make good on her end of their arrangement. The place was in worse condition than she had initially realized. Every pot and pan needed thorough scrubbing. The floors had not been properly swept in what looked like months, and the corners were festooned with cobwebs that suggested Xavier had given up on domestic maintenance entirely. Eleanor tied a cloth over her hair and set to work, finding satisfaction in the simple act of bringing order to chaos. Her leg forced her to work in shifts, cleaning for a while and then resting, but by the time the sun reached its peak, she had made visible progress. The main room looked almost civilized. The pots gleamed on their shelves, and fresh water waited in the bucket beside the door. Eleanor made simple stew for dinner, using dried meat and vegetables, setting it to simmer slowly over the fire so it would be ready when Xavier returned. Then she turned her attention to the neglected garden, carefully weeding between rows of herbs that had somehow survived without tending. She found mint and sage, thyme and orgery, even a few struggling potato plants that might yield a small harvest if given proper care. She was sitting on the porch steps, resting her aching leg and enjoying the afternoon sunshine, when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl came from the edge of the clearing, and Eleanor looked up to see a massive black bear emerging from the tree line, its attention fixed on something near the cabin. Eleanor's mind raced. Xavier had said bears were common in these mountains, but he had not told her what to do if she encountered one. The rifle was inside the cabin, and she was not confident in her ability to hit a moving target, especially one as large and dangerous as a bear. The bear shambled closer, and Eleanor realized with horror that it was heading toward the lean to where Xavier kept his stores of dried meat. If the bear got into those supplies, they would lose their entire winter reserve. Eleanor forced herself to stand, her heart hammering against her ribs, and began making as much noise as possible, banging on the porch rail and shouting at the top of her lungs. The bear stopped and regarded her with small, intelligent eyes, clearly weighing whether this noisy human was a threat worth avoiding. Eleanor kept shouting, praying that her bravado would be enough to send the animal away. For a long moment, the bear simply stood there, and Eleanor was certain she was about to die alone on a mountain, killed by a wild animal because she had been too proud to stay in Las Vegas. Then the crack of a rifle shot split the air, and the bear reared up on its hind legs with a roar of surprise. Eleanor spun to see Xavier emerging from the forest at a run, his rifle raised for another shot if needed. He fired into the air again, and the bear dropped to all fours and lumbered away into the trees, deciding that easier meals could be found elsewhere. Xavier reached the porch in seconds, his face pale beneath his tan. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. "No, I am fine," Eleanor managed, though her voice shook. "It was after your meat stores." Xavier looked toward the lean-to, then back at Eleanor, and something like respect crossed his face. "You drove it off yourself." "I made noise," Eleanor said. "I did not know what else to do." "That was exactly right," Xavier said. "Most bears will leave if you make yourself loud and threatening, but that was a big male, and if he had decided to ignore you—" He did not finish the sentence, but Eleanor understood well enough. "I am sorry," she said. "I should have gotten the rifle." "You did fine," Xavier assured her. "Better than fine. Many people would have panicked and run, which is the worst thing you can do with a bear." He disappeared into the cabin and returned with the rifle, pressing it into her hands. "Keep this with you when I am gone," he said. "At least until you are more familiar with the area and what to watch for." Eleanor accepted the weapon, still trembling from the encounter. Xavier guided her to sit on the porch steps, then disappeared inside and returned with a cup of cool water. "Drink," he commanded, and Eleanor obeyed, grateful for something to do with her shaking hands. Xavier sat beside her on the steps, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have warned you more thoroughly about the wildlife before I left you alone." "You cannot anticipate everything," Eleanor said. "And I am fine, frightened, but fine." They sat in silence for a moment, Eleanor's heartbeat gradually slowing to something approaching normal. She was acutely aware of Xavier's presence beside her, the solid strength of him, the way he had come running at the first sign of trouble. He had not hesitated, had not calculated the risk to himself, had simply acted to protect her. "What did you catch?" Eleanor asked, needing to change the subject before she said something foolish. Xavier seemed to understand her need for normalcy. "2 rabbits and a grouse," he said. "Enough for several meals if we are careful. And I checked the trap lines. Looks like we will have some pelts ready soon." They prepared the rabbits together, Xavier skinning and butchering while Eleanor seasoned and arranged them for roasting. The domesticity of the task, the easy way they worked side by side without needing to fill every silence with words, felt comfortable in a way Eleanor had not experienced with another person in a very long time. Over the following weeks, they settled into a rhythm. Xavier would leave in the early morning to check traps and hunt, returning before dark with whatever game he had caught. Eleanor would tend the cabin and prepare meals, her leg gradually growing stronger as she adapted to the altitude and the constant movement required by her work. Xavier was true to his word about not expecting her to do heavy labor. He hauled all the water, chopped all the wood, and never once complained when Eleanor had to rest her leg. But he also never treated her as if she were fragile or helpless, consulting her about decisions regarding supplies and trusting her judgment on domestic matters. Eleanor found herself looking forward to Xavier's returns each evening, to the quiet conversations they shared over dinner. She learned about his life before the mountains, how he had grown up in Missouri and headed west as a young man seeking adventure. He had met his wife Sarah in Carson City, where she had been working as a seamstress. They had been happy together, he said, and Eleanor heard the lingering grief in his voice when he spoke of her. "You must miss her terribly," Eleanor said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I do," Xavier admitted, "but grief becomes a different thing over time. Less sharp, more like an ache you learn to live with. She would not have wanted me to stop living my life." Eleanor told him about her own losses, about her father's death, and the accident that had shattered her leg and her prospects. She found herself confiding things she had never spoken aloud. The hurt of being abandoned by people she had thought were friends. The crushing weight of becoming a burden rather than a help. "Their loss," Xavier said simply when she finished. "Anyone who cannot see past a physical limitation to value the person underneath is not worth your time or grief." His matter-of-fact acceptance of her injury, his complete lack of pity or awkwardness around her limitations, was healing in a way Eleanor had not expected. For the first time since the accident, she began to think of herself as something other than damaged. As summer faded into early autumn, the mountains transformed into a riot of gold and red. Xavier taught Eleanor to preserve the game he brought in, showing her how to smoke meat and render fat, how to salt and dry strips of venison for winter stores. She taught him small refinements in cooking, ways to make even simple ingredients more flavorful and satisfying. One morning in late September, Eleanor woke to find the first frost coating the meadow, transforming the grass into a field of diamonds. She stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl, watching the sun melt the ice into sparkling dew, and realized she was happy. Not content or resigned to her circumstances, but genuinely happy in a way she had not been since before her father died. The sound of the door opening made her turn. Xavier emerged carrying 2 cups of coffee, offering her one as he joined her at the porch rail. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping the hot brew and watching the day brighten. "Winter will be here soon," Xavier said. "Another month, maybe 6 weeks. We should make a trip down to Las Vegas to stock up on supplies before the passes become difficult." Eleanor felt her stomach clench at the thought of returning to town, of facing the people who had made her feel so worthless. But they did need supplies: flour and sugar, coffee and salt, things that could not be hunted or gathered. "When would we go?" she asked. "Next week, if the weather holds," Xavier said. "We will take the wagon down, stay overnight at the boarding house if Mrs. Whitmore has room, and come back the following day." The thought of spending a night under Mrs. Whitmore's roof again made Eleanor want to protest, but she recognized the practicality of the plan. It would be difficult to make the round trip in a single day, especially with a loaded wagon on the return journey. They left the following Tuesday morning, the wagon empty except for furs and pelts that Xavier would trade for supplies. Eleanor dressed in her best dress, armor against the judgment she knew awaited her in town, and tried to quiet the anxiety that made her stomach roil. The journey down the mountain was easier than the trip up had been, though Eleanor's legs still protested the hours in the wagon. When they stopped to rest at the spring where they had paused on their first journey together, Xavier looked at her thoughtfully. "Your leg is hurting," he observed. "It is manageable," Eleanor said, which was not quite a lie. "I could carry you again," Xavier offered, "if you would prefer." The idea was tempting, both for the relief it would provide her leg and for the strange comfort she had found in being close to him. But Eleanor shook her head. "I can manage the wagon for the rest of the way. Save your strength for hauling supplies." Xavier accepted her decision without argument, but she noticed he drove more carefully for the remainder of the journey, avoiding the worst of the ruts and rocks that would jar her painfully. They reached Las Vegas in the late afternoon, the town looking smaller and shabbier than Eleanor remembered. Word of their arrival seemed to spread quickly, and Eleanor was aware of faces appearing in windows, people pausing on the street to stare as Xavier drove the wagon to the general store. Mr. Hammond came out to greet them, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Crane, Miss Zane, welcome back to Las Vegas. What can I do for you today?" Xavier handed him a list of supplies they would need, and Mr. Hammond's eyebrows rose as he scanned it. "This is quite a large order. It will take me some time to gather everything." "We can wait," Xavier said. "We will be staying at the boarding house tonight and collecting the supplies in the morning." Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, trying not to show how stiff and sore her leg had become. Several women stood outside the dressmaker's shop, watching her with avid curiosity. She recognized them as the same women who had whispered about her months ago, and she lifted her chin defiantly, refusing to let them see how their scrutiny affected her. "Eleanor, there you are, Mrs." Whitmore emerged from her boarding house across the street, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her age. "I have been worried sick about you. You said you would write." "I apologize," Eleanor said sincerely. "The time got away from me." In truth, she had been so busy settling into her new life that writing letters had seemed unimportant. Mrs. Whitmore looked her over critically, and Eleanor braced herself for disapproval. Instead, the older woman's face softened. "You look well," she said, and there was genuine surprise in her voice. "Better than I have seen you since before the accident. Mountain life must agree with you." "It does," Eleanor admitted. "And Mr. Crane has treated you properly?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her sharp gaze moving to Xavier. "He has been nothing but respectful," Eleanor assured her. "He is a good employer and has become a good friend." Xavier inclined his head in acknowledgement of the compliment, his expression remaining neutral. Mrs. Whitmore seemed satisfied with this response. "Well then, you must both stay for dinner," she declared. "I have a pot roast that is nearly ready, and there is plenty for everyone. You can tell me all about your mountain adventure. Dinner at the boarding house was a strange experience." Eleanor found herself the object of intense curiosity from the other boarders, all of them wanting to know about life in the wilderness. She answered their questions as best she could, aware of Xavier's quiet presence beside her, his solid bulk somehow protective even in this crowded room. After the meal, several of the women who had mocked Eleanor's limp months ago approached her, their expressions a mixture of shame and curiosity. "We heard you have been living up in the mountains," one of them said. "Is it terribly frightening being so isolated?" "No more frightening than facing a town full of false friends," Eleanor said calmly, and the woman had the grace to blush. Another woman, braver than the first, asked, "Is it true you are keeping house for Mr. Crane, living alone with him in his cabin?" "It is true that I am employed as his housekeeper," Eleanor confirmed. "Mr. Crane has been unfailingly respectful, and I have my own private quarters. The arrangement is entirely proper." The women exchanged glances, clearly not entirely convinced but unable to argue with Eleanor's calm assurance. Margaret Sullivan, Eleanor's former friend who had crossed the street to avoid her, approached last. "Eleanor, I owe you an apology," Margaret said quietly. "I was unkind after your accident. I allowed other people's opinions to influence me when I should have stood by you." Eleanor studied the other woman's face, looking for signs of insincerity, but Margaret's regret appeared genuine. "Thank you for saying so," Eleanor said finally. "I appreciate your honesty." "Are you truly happy up there?" Margaret asked. "Or are you simply making the best of difficult circumstances?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I am truly happy," she said, and realized as she spoke that it was absolutely true. "Happier than I have been in a very long time." That night, lying in a proper bed in Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house, Eleanor found she could not sleep. The room felt too small, too closed in after months of mountain air and wide open spaces. She missed the sound of wind in the pines, the burble of the stream, even the rustic simplicity of her small room in the cabin. She missed Xavier, she realized with a start. Missed his quiet presence, the way he would sit by the fire in the evenings and whittle small pieces of wood into clever shapes. Missed the sound of his deep voice asking about her day, genuinely interested in the small details of domestic life. Missed the feeling of safety and acceptance she felt in his company. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. Xavier had been very clear from the beginning that he was not looking for a wife. He had loved Sarah deeply, and Eleanor could not compete with the ghost of a perfect marriage. Allowing herself to develop feelings for him was foolish and could only lead to heartache. But her heart seemed determined to ignore logic. Over the past months, Eleanor had fallen in love with the quiet mountain man who carried her when she tired and never complained once, who treated her injury as a simple fact rather than a tragedy, who valued her for what she could do rather than dismissing her for what she could not. The next morning they loaded the wagon with supplies under Mr. Hammond's supervision. The weight of flour and sugar, coffee and salt, plus the various other necessities they had purchased, made the wagon sit low on its springs. Xavier inspected the load carefully, redistributing weight to balance the burden, his movements efficient and sure. "That is everything," Mr. Hammond said, presenting Xavier with the final accounting. Xavier paid from the money he had received for his furs, and Eleanor noted with satisfaction that they had come out ahead on the transaction. Xavier was a shrewd trader despite his rough appearance. They said goodbye to Mrs. Whitmore, who pressed a package of tea cakes into Eleanor's hands with instructions to write more regularly. Eleanor promised she would, and this time she meant it. The journey back up the mountain was slower with the loaded wagon, and Xavier was forced to stop more frequently to rest the mules. At one of these stops, Eleanor climbed down to stretch her legs and found Xavier watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What is it?" she asked. "You seem different in town," Xavier said slowly. "Stronger somehow, more confident." Eleanor considered this. "I suppose I am. Living in the mountains has taught me that I am capable of more than I thought, that my injury does not define me." "It never should have defined you," Xavier said with quiet intensity. "Those people in town were fools not to see your worth." The warmth in his voice made Eleanor's heart skip, but she pushed down the hope that tried to rise. He was simply being kind, she told herself. Being a good friend and employer. They reached the cabin just as the sun was setting, painting the meadow in shades of orange and purple. Eleanor had never been so glad to see any place in her life. While Xavier unhitched the mules and saw to their care, she started a fire and began preparing a simple supper from their fresh supplies. They ate together as the stars emerged, and Xavier told her about improvements he wanted to make before winter set in properly. He wanted to reinforce the lean-to, add additional storage for the winter supplies, perhaps build a smokehouse for preserving meat. "I could use your help with the planning," he said. "You have a good eye for practical details." Eleanor felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. Over the following weeks, as they worked together to prepare for winter, she found herself constantly aware of Xavier in new ways. The strength in his shoulders as he lifted heavy beams, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at one of her comments, the gentleness in his hands when he showed her a new skill. The first real snow came in early November, blanketing the meadow in white silence. Eleanor woke to find the world transformed, the familiar landscape made strange and beautiful by the covering of snow. Xavier had been up since before dawn, she discovered, clearing a path from the cabin to the lean-to, and hauling extra firewood to stack on the porch. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said, standing in the doorway and watching fat flakes continue to fall. "It is dangerous," Xavier corrected, but his tone was gentle. "This is just the beginning. By January, the snow will be over your head in places, and we will be completely cut off from the outside world until spring." The idea should have frightened Eleanor, but instead, she felt only a strange sense of peace. She had everything she needed here: shelter, food, companionship. And if her heart longed for more than companionship, well, she would simply have to learn to live with that unfulfilled desire. Winter closed in around them like a fist, the snow piling higher with each storm until the world shrank to just the cabin and the small area Xavier kept cleared around it. They fell into new rhythms, spending long evenings by the fire while Xavier worked on repairs to his traps and Eleanor mended or knitted. Sometimes, Xavier would read aloud from one of the few books they had, his deep voice bringing stories to life in the flickering firelight. One night in late December, a particularly fierce blizzard raged outside, the wind howling like a living thing and rattling the shutters. Eleanor sat close to the fire, trying to ignore the cold drafts that found their way through every crack and crevice. Xavier had been outside checking on the animals, and when he finally came back in, he was covered in snow and shivering despite his heavy coat. "The temperature is dropping fast," he announced, stamping snow from his boots. "This is going to be a bad one." He was right. By morning, the fire had burned so low that Eleanor's breath frosted in the air, and ice had formed on the inside of the window glass. Xavier built up the fire quickly, but even with the flames roaring, the cabin remained bitterly cold. "The wind is coming from the north," Xavier said, studying the way snow had drifted against the cabin. "That is the coldest wind, straight down from the Arctic. We need to conserve heat as much as possible." He hung blankets over the door and windows, creating additional insulation against the cold. Eleanor made hot soup for their midday meal, and they ate close to the fire, trying to warm themselves from the inside out. That night, the temperature dropped even further. Eleanor lay in her bed wrapped in every blanket she owned, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. She could hear Xavier moving around in the main room, adding more wood to the fire, but even that was not enough to drive back the killing cold. A soft knock on her door made her sit up. "Come in," she called, her voice quavering. Xavier entered carrying an armload of blankets and furs. His face was grave. "Eleanor, I do not want to alarm you, but this cold is dangerous. People can freeze to death in their sleep in temperatures like this. We need to share body heat." Eleanor understood what he was suggesting and felt heat flood her cheeks despite the cold. "Mr. Crane, I will sleep on the floor near the fire," Xavier interrupted. "But you should bring your bedding out here. The main room stays warmer, and if the temperature continues to drop, we may need to sleep close to each other for survival. I give you my word as a gentleman that I will not take advantage of the situation." Eleanor recognized the wisdom in his suggestion, even as her heart raced at the thought of sleeping near him. She gathered her blankets and followed him to the main room, where he had already created a nest of furs and quilts near the hearth. "You take the bedding closest to the fire," Xavier directed. "I will sleep between you and the door to block any drafts." They arranged themselves as modestly as possible, both fully clothed with a careful distance maintained between them. But even through the layers of blankets and propriety, Eleanor was acutely aware of Xavier's presence, the warmth radiating from his large body, the sound of his breathing in the darkness. The temperature continued to plummet through the night. Eleanor woke shivering violently, her nose and fingers numb despite the blankets. She felt Xavier stir beside her. "You are freezing," he said quietly. Eleanor, I am going to put my arms around you just to share warmth, nothing more." Before she could respond, he moved closer and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back against his chest. The heat of him was shocking after hours of cold, and Eleanor could not suppress a small sound of relief. Xavier arranged the blankets around them both, creating a cocoon of shared warmth. "Better," he murmured, his breath stirring her hair. "Much better," Eleanor managed, though her shivering was now caused as much by his proximity as by the cold. She felt Xavier's arms tighten around her slightly, and then he began to rub her arms and back through the blankets, trying to restore circulation to her chilled limbs. The gentle friction was both comforting and somehow intimate, and Eleanor found herself relaxing into his embrace despite the impropriety. "Thank you," she whispered, "for taking care of me. Again." "Always," Xavier said, and there was something in his voice that made Eleanor's breath catch. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside while the fire crackled and popped. Eleanor could feel Xavier's heart beating steady and strong against her back, could feel the rise and fall of his chest with each breath. This close, she could smell the scent of him: wood smoke and pine, leather and something uniquely him. "Eleanor," Xavier said quietly after a long silence, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy here?" "Truly happy? Or were you simply telling those women in town what you thought they wanted to hear?" Eleanor thought about her answer carefully. "I am happier here than I have ever been," she said honestly. "I feel valued and useful. I feel like I belong." She felt Xavier's arms tighten around her again. "I am glad," he said, "because I do not know what I would do without you now. You have made this cabin into a home again, made my life into something more than just surviving." Eleanor's heart began to pound. "Xavier, I know I said I was not looking for a wife," he interrupted. "I know I told you this was just an employment arrangement, but somewhere along the way that changed for me. You changed it, and if you do not feel the same way, I understand, but I needed you to know." Eleanor turned in his arms so she could see his face, illuminated by the dying firelight. His expression was open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "You are saying you have feelings for me?" she asked, needing to hear the words clearly. "I am saying I have fallen in love with you," Xavier said simply. "With your strength and your courage, your kindness and your stubbornness. With the way you faced down a bear to protect my supplies, and the way you never complain even when I know your leg pains you. With everything you are, Eleanor." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, freezing almost immediately in the cold air. "I thought you still loved Sarah. I thought I could never compete with her memory." "I will always love Sarah," Xavier said gently. "She was my first love, and she will always have a place in my heart. But she is gone, and you are here, and my heart has room for both of you. Sarah would have liked you, I think. She would have approved of this." Eleanor reached up and touched his bearded face with trembling fingers. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been trying not to, because I thought you did not want me that way, but I love you so much it hurts sometimes." Xavier closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. Then he opened them again and looked at her with such tenderness that Eleanor felt her breath catch. "May I kiss you?" he asked. In answer, Eleanor closed the small distance between them and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning each other's rhythms. But then Xavier's arms tightened around her and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent and passionate. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not because of propriety or practicality, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Marry me, Eleanor." "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, And this time Eleanor felt no cold, only the warmth of Xavier's love surrounding her like the sun. They stayed awake talking through the rest of the night, making plans and sharing dreams, learning all the small details about each other that lovers need to know. The blizzard blew itself out by morning, and the world emerged brilliant and sparkling under fresh snow. Xavier and Eleanor stood on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sunrise paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. "We will have to wait until spring to make the trip to town for a proper wedding," Xavier said practically. "Unless you want to be married by just the two of us here." "I want it to be legal and recognized," Eleanor said. "I want everyone in Las Vegas to know that you chose me, limp and all." Xavier turned her in his arms and kissed her soundly. "I did not choose you despite your limp," he said firmly. "I chose you because you are brave and strong and beautiful, because you make me laugh and think and feel alive again. Your injury is just a part of who you are, no more important than the color of your eyes or the sound of your voice." Eleanor felt tears threaten again, but these were happy tears. For the first time in her life, someone saw her as whole and complete, valued her for everything she was rather than dismissing her for what she was not. The winter passed in a haze of happiness. Xavier and Eleanor made plans for their future, talking about improvements to the cabin, about whether they wanted children, about the life they would build together. Xavier taught Eleanor to shoot more accurately, to read animal tracks in the snow, to predict weather changes by watching the sky. Eleanor taught Xavier to cook more than just basic survival fare, to appreciate small comforts and domestic pleasures he had forgotten in his 2 years alone. They were scrupulously careful about maintaining propriety until they could be properly married, but the promise of their future together lent warmth to even the coldest days. Eleanor had never imagined she could be this happy, that love could feel so comfortable and right, like coming home after a long journey. In early April, when the snow had melted enough to make the trail passable, they loaded the wagon and made the trip down to Las Vegas. This time, there was no pain in Eleanor's leg because Xavier had fashioned a special cushion for the wagon seat, and he drove with exquisite care over every bump and rut. They went directly to the small church at the edge of town, where Reverend Morrison agreed to perform the wedding ceremony that very afternoon. Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Hammond stood as witnesses, both beaming with approval at the match. Eleanor wore her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Xavier had trimmed his beard and put on his one good shirt. "Do you, Xavier Crane, take Eleanor Zane to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Morrison intoned. "I do," Xavier said clearly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "And do you, Eleanor Zane, take Xavier Crane to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Eleanor said, her voice strong and sure. They exchanged simple gold bands that Xavier had commissioned from the town blacksmith, and when Reverend Morrison pronounced them man and wife, Xavier kissed Eleanor with such enthusiasm that Mrs. Whitmore clucked disapprovingly even as she smiled. They spent one night at the boarding house as a married couple, Eleanor blushing as Mrs. Whitmore fussed over them, and the other boarders offered congratulations. The women who had mocked Eleanor's limp were notably silent, though Eleanor caught them watching with expressions that might have been regret or envy. Margaret Sullivan came to say goodbye before they left the next morning. "I am truly happy for you, Eleanor," she said sincerely. "You deserve every happiness." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and found that she meant it. She bore no grudges now, not when her own life was so full of joy and promise. The journey back to the cabin felt different this time, the mountains welcoming them home as a married couple rather than as employer and employee. Eleanor sat close to Xavier on the wagon seat, his arm around her shoulders, dreaming of the life they would build together. Over the following months, they worked to expand the cabin, adding a second room that would eventually serve as a nursery. Xavier taught Eleanor everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the mountains, while Eleanor brought comfort and warmth to their home. They were partners in every sense of the word, each contributing their strengths to create something stronger than either could have managed alone. In the spring of 1880, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a healthy boy they named Samuel. Xavier was beside himself with joy, cradling his tiny son with such gentleness that Eleanor fell in love with him all over again. Samuel inherited his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's determination, and from the moment he could walk, he followed Xavier everywhere, learning the ways of the mountains from his father. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family. They named her Sarah, after Xavier's first wife, and Eleanor felt no jealousy in the naming. Sarah had been part of Xavier's life, and honoring her memory seemed right and proper. Little Sarah had her mother's dark hair and her father's adventurous spirit, and the cabin rang with children's laughter in a way it never had before. Eleanor's leg never healed completely, and there were still days when the pain was significant. But Xavier never wavered in his support, carrying her when she tired and never complaining once. The children grew up seeing their father's care for their mother as simply the way love worked, learning by example that true partnership meant supporting each other through difficulties. On a warm summer evening in 1885, Eleanor sat on the porch watching Xavier play with their children in the meadow. Samuel, now 5, was showing his father a bird's nest he had found, while 3-year-old Sarah toddled after them on sturdy legs, demanding her share of attention. Eleanor's hand rested on her swollen belly, where their third child grew, due to arrive before the first snow. Xavier looked up and caught her watching, and his face split into the brilliant smile she loved so much. He scooped up both children and came to join her on the porch, settling beside her with Samuel on his lap and Sarah tucked under his arm. "Happy?" he asked, as he did so often. "Completely," Eleanor answered, as she always did, and it was true. She had traveled so far from the lonely, mocked woman limping through the streets of Las Vegas, dismissed as damaged and worthless. She had found not just employment or even just love, but a true home and a true partner, someone who saw her whole and chose her anyway, who carried her when she tired and never complained once. The children were chattering about their day, and Xavier was listening with the focused attention he gave to everything they said, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with gratitude for this life she had found in the mountains. She had thought the stagecoach accident that shattered her leg had destroyed her future, but it had actually led her here, to this perfect moment, to this perfect family. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and purple, Xavier reached over and took Eleanor's hand, lacing their fingers together. No words were necessary. After 7 years together, they could communicate volumes with a touch, a look, a shared smile. The summer faded into autumn, and in October, Eleanor gave birth to another healthy boy. They named him Thomas, and he proved to be the quietest of their children, content to watch the world with solemn eyes rather than charging at it head first like his siblings. Xavier doted on all 3 children equally, involving them in his work as soon as they were old enough to be useful, teaching them to respect the mountains and the creatures that lived there. The years rolled by in a rhythm of seasons, each bringing its own challenges and joys. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved tracking animals through the forest with his father. Sarah developed her mother's skill with domestic arts, learning to cook and sew and preserve food, though she also insisted on learning to shoot and trap alongside her brothers. Thomas surprised everyone by developing a passion for reading and learning, devouring every book that came into the house and begging his parents to bring more back from their occasional trips to town. Eleanor and Xavier made the journey to Las Vegas once or twice a year, bringing furs to trade and stocking up on supplies. Each time, Eleanor noticed how the town had changed and grown, new buildings going up and new people arriving. But she felt no envy for the town life she had left behind. Her life in the mountains with Xavier and their children was richer than anything Las Vegas could offer. On one such trip, when Eleanor was 35 and Xavier 42, they encountered Margaret Sullivan in the general store. Margaret had married and had children of her own, and she and Eleanor fell into easy conversation about the trials and triumphs of motherhood. "You look so happy," Margaret said wistfully. "I confess I envied you terribly when you first married Xavier. Everyone thought you were ruining your life, going off to live in isolation with a mountain man, but you proved us all wrong." "I proved to myself that I was stronger than I thought," Eleanor corrected gently. "Xavier just gave me the space and support to discover it." As they prepared to leave town with their loaded wagon, Xavier helped Eleanor up onto the seat with the same gentle care he had shown on their very first journey together. Her leg was more troublesome as she aged, arthritis setting in to compound the old injury. But Xavier never showed impatience with her slower pace or her need for accommodation. Samuel, now 14 and nearly as tall as his father, drove the wagon while Xavier rode alongside on horseback. Sarah, 12, sat with her mother and chattered about everything she had seen in town. Thomas, 10, had his nose buried in a new book Xavier had purchased for him, already lost in whatever story held his attention. Eleanor watched her family with profound contentment. This was what she had gained from the accident that everyone had treated as a tragedy: this life, this love, these children, this sense of belonging and purpose. If she could go back and change the past, prevent the stagecoach crash that had shattered her leg, she was not sure she would. That injury had set her on the path that led her here, to Xavier, to this life in the mountains that fit her like a perfectly tailored glove. That night, camped halfway between town and the cabin, Eleanor and Xavier lay together under the stars while the children slept nearby. Xavier's arm was around her shoulders, and Eleanor's head rested on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Taking a chance on a crippled housekeeper instead of finding a whole, healthy wife?" Xavier was silent for a moment, and Eleanor could feel him choosing his words carefully. "I regret nothing about our life together," he said finally. "You are whole, Eleanor. You always have been. The people who could not see that were the ones with impaired vision, not you with an impaired leg." Eleanor smiled in the darkness, blinking back the tears that still came sometimes when Xavier said exactly the right thing to heal old wounds. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," Xavier replied. "Always have, always will." More years passed, bringing more changes. Samuel married a girl from one of the neighboring homesteads and built his own cabin a few miles away, though he still helped his father with the trap lines and hunting. Sarah, independent and fierce, announced at 18 that she was not interested in marriage, preferring to explore the mountains and document the plants and animals she found there. Xavier and Eleanor supported her choice, understanding that happiness took different forms for different people. Thomas, surprising everyone, decided to become a teacher. He went to Carson City at age 20 to get his certification, but he returned to the mountains every summer, unable to stay away from the place that had shaped him. Eleanor, now in her mid-40s, found her leg increasingly troublesome. There were days when she could barely walk, when the pain was sharp enough to take her breath away. But Xavier was always there, lifting her without effort, carrying her wherever she needed to go, never once complaining about the burden. "You are not a burden," he told her firmly whenever she apologized. "You are my wife, my partner, my love. Carrying you is not a hardship, it is a privilege." On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Eleanor by commissioning a special gift. He had worked all winter in secret, crafting a beautiful rocking chair with a high back and padded seat, designed specifically to support Eleanor's leg in comfort. He had carved their initials intertwined on the back, along with the date of their wedding. Eleanor wept when she saw it, understanding the hours of patient work that had gone into this expression of love. She sat in the chair and rocked gently, and Xavier knelt beside her, his large, weathered hands covering hers. 20 years, he said softly. "And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Even the parts where you had to carry me up a mountain," Eleanor asked with a watery smile. "Especially those parts," Xavier said seriously. "Those were the times when I got to show you how much you mean to me, when I got to be strong for both of us." Eleanor leaned down and kissed him, tasting salt from her own tears. After 20 years, the passion between them had not dimmed, though it had evolved into something deeper and more comfortable, like a fire that burned steady and warm rather than hot and wild. The children came to visit for the anniversary celebration, bringing grandchildren now. Samuel's wife had given birth to twin girls the previous spring, and Sarah had surprised everyone by falling in love with a cartographer who had come to map the mountains, though she insisted they would have a partnership of equals rather than a traditional marriage. Thomas had brought his sweetheart from Carson City, a fellow teacher who shared his love of learning. The cabin was full of noise and laughter. Multiple generations gathered to celebrate the love that had started it all. Eleanor, sitting in her new rocking chair with a grandchild on her lap, looked around at the family she and Xavier had created and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Xavier caught her eye across the crowded room and smiled, that special smile he reserved just for her. 20 years of marriage, and he could still make her heart flutter with just a look. As the celebration wound down and their children prepared to return to their own homes, Eleanor stood on the porch to say goodbye, Xavier's arm steady around her waist for support. The mountains stretched away in all directions, familiar and beloved, the landscape that had witnessed their love story from beginning to middle and onward toward whatever ending awaited them. "We built a good life here," Eleanor said softly. "We did," Xavier agreed, "and we are not done yet." He was right. They had many more years together, years that brought both challenges and joys. Eleanor's health fluctuated, her legs sometimes better and sometimes worse, but Xavier's devotion never wavered. He carried her when she tired, cared for her when she was ill, loved her through every season of their lives together. They grew old in the mountains, their hair turning silver, their faces weathering like the cabin logs. But the love between them only deepened, becoming the bedrock of not just their own lives but their children's and grandchildren's understanding of what love should be. On a crisp autumn morning in 1899, Eleanor woke to find Xavier already up and making coffee, as he had done nearly every morning for 21 years. She was 66 years old now, Xavier 73, and she knew their time together was drawing toward its natural conclusion. But she felt no fear, only profound gratitude for the years they had been given. Xavier brought her coffee in bed, settling beside her with his own cup. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold, and Eleanor thought about the long, winding road that had brought her to this moment. She had been mocked for her limp, dismissed as damaged and worthless, told by society that she had nothing to offer. But Xavier had seen past the injury to the person beneath. had valued her for her strength and courage rather than dismissing her for her physical limitation. He had carried her when she tired and never complained once, treating her difficulty with matter-of-fact kindness that had allowed her to heal emotionally as well as physically. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked, noticing her pensive expression. "About how lucky I am," Eleanor said simply. "To have found you, to have built this life with you. About how what everyone else saw as a tragedy led me to the greatest happiness I have ever known." Xavier set down his coffee cup and gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "I am the lucky one," he murmured against her hair. "You saved me, Eleanor. After Sarah died, I was just going through the motions of living. You reminded me what it meant to truly be alive." They held each other as the sun climbed higher, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, when they needed it most. Their love story had started with mockery and injury, with desperate need and practical arrangement. But it had grown into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of seeing people for who they truly are rather than judging them by surface appearances. Eleanor and Xavier lived many more years in their mountain cabin, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. They faced the challenges of aging together, supporting each other through illness and injury, celebrating small victories and mourning inevitable losses. When Xavier finally passed away at the age of 81, peacefully in his sleep after a full day of working in the garden, Eleanor grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 44 years together, far more than many couples received, and they had made the most of every single one of those years. Eleanor lived 3 more years after Xavier's death, staying in the cabin they had shared, cared for by her children who took turns keeping her company. She spent her final years in the rocking chair Xavier had made for her, telling stories to her great-grandchildren about the mountain man who had carried her when she tired and never complained once, who had loved her not despite her limitations, but because of the whole person she was. On a soft spring morning in 1906, Eleanor Crane passed away quietly at the age of 73. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her. Her last words were Xavier's name, and those present swore they saw her face light up with joy just before she took her final breath, as if she could see him waiting for her. They buried her beside Xavier on a hillside overlooking the meadow, where wildflowers bloomed every spring, and the mountains stood eternal watch. 2 simple headstones marked the graves, but the true monument to their love was the family they had created, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the lessons Eleanor and Xavier had taught about strength, compassion, and seeing past surface appearances to value the person beneath. And if sometimes hikers passing through the area reported seeing an impossibly tall man carrying a woman through the meadow at twilight, both of them laughing as they disappeared into the trees, well, some love stories do not end with death. Some continue on, eternal as the mountains themselves, a reminder that true love sees no limitations, only possibilities,